solar mini-grids have turned from small pilots to an electrification wave. We were there when mini-grid regulation was established. When financial transactions were closed, we saw new technology thrive and companies fail. This is where we tell the stories. This is where we discuss the future. The mini-grid business, powered by Inensys.
Hello, this is Nico. Welcome to our episode on where to go next. Which countries are at the top of the funders list? My guests are representatives of three major funding institutions. Benjamin from AFDB SEFA, Tatia from World Bank ESMAP, and Dennis from the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, GEAPP. Benjamin Curnier is a Sustainability and Management Director with nearly 20 years of experience. He joined AFDB's Sustainable Energy Fund for Africa, SEFA, as the Green Mini-Grid lead to the day exactly 2 years ago. Happy anniversary, Ben. Benjamin is responsible for the development and delivery of SEFA's Green Mini-Grid portfolio of investments. This includes leading the design and delivery of the Africa Mini-Grid Accelerator Program, AMAP, which is SEFA's flagship TA program, and the design of funding solutions for green mini-grid programs in several countries, including Guinea, Mauritania, and Ethiopia. Tatia Lemondzhava is an energy specialist with the World Bank's Energy Sector Management Assistance Program, ESMAP, where she leads the global facility on mini-grids, which provides technical assistance and grant support to pipeline and ongoing lending projects with mini-grid components across the World Bank portfolio. Tatia is also part of several World Bank operational teams implementing large-scale lending projects in key priority energy access countries, such as Nigeria and Ethiopia, where she leads the dialogue with the governments and key sector stakeholders on delivering electrification through mini-grids and off-grid methods. Dennis Nderitu is the manager of energy systems at the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, GEAPP. He provides technical support, input, and advisory across GEAPP's partnerships and projects. Before joining GEAPP, he has worked in Energy for Impact, deploying solar, biomass, and hydro mini-grid technology with Davis and Shurtleff in C&I Solar and in PowerGen Renewable Energy for mini-grids in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda. Once again, welcome everyone. To get started, I would like to find out what is the motivation behind funding the mini-grid sector for a large funding group, a development bank, and so on.
So from the World Bank's perspective, as you might know, we have conducted a lot of research and analytics into the sector, especially in our program in ESMAP. And it's very clear and obvious to us that mini-grids have a tremendous potential to help close the electricity access gap by 2030. From our assessments, we believe that modern mini-grids, third-generation mini-grids, could serve as the least cost solution to electrify about 490 million people by 2030. So for us, this is not really a question of why mini-grids, but a question of where do mini-grids make the most sense. And as we work with our client governments to help them create comprehensive, data-informed national electrification programs, we offer them a suite of options to support, be that through the grid, through mini-grids and off-grid. And it's our job to really make the case for each solution makes the most sense in each context and go from there.
That's interesting. Are mini-grids always embedded in larger programs on the World Bank end?
No, but that is increasingly what we're seeing. With the World Bank, really, it's demand-driven work. So it's not our job to tell governments where exactly they should direct the funds that they borrow from the bank. At the end of the day, they're borrowing credits from us, right? Loans, highly concessional, but still loans from us. And it is up to the government and to the line ministries to determine what is the best way to use those funds. But it is our job to work with them to help develop the data and the analytics to understand what are the best tools available, what are the most innovative and frontier options available, the business models, and what they can do to create an environment for those to take off at scale. So we are seeing increasingly more and more mini-grid demand from our client governments. And not just that, but in terms of the scale that governments are looking for. Fewer and fewer countries come to us asking for pilots and to understand if mini-grids could work in one or two communities. More and more, there's really demand for comprehensive support, portfolio programs, and really having them embedded as core options in addition to the grid and standalone solar.
All right. Ben, is that the same at your end in AFDB?
Yes and no all at the same time. I think it's important to distinguish between the AFDB, which obviously has a very similar business model to the World Bank, and through its lending will lend to national programs or to sovereign operations, versus SEFA, which is the fund for which I work more specifically, which is a special fund within the bank which administers donor-funded monies and invests those very specifically into private sector-led business models that deploy renewable energy on the continent. Load, which is utility scale renewables and energy efficiency. The objective here is always to fund the deployment of private sector-led business models to deploy renewable assets on the ground. And green mini grids kind of probably takes up around 30 to 40% of the overall SEFA portfolio. Our investment is broadly in two types. So we do the provision of technical assistance support, and that funds feasibility studies, impact studies, enabling environment support, and there kind of our beneficiaries may ultimately be the public sector. So we might work with a government in order to review the regulatory environment, to promote private sector participation in a green mini-grid market, or indeed identify sites, conduct preliminary feasibility on those sites with a view to then eventually running a national scale green mini-grid program. And then on top of that, we then move into our concessional funding instruments, which are funding the projects themselves. Now, in the green mini-grid space, often that's viability capex grants, could be reimbursable grants, or indeed concessional debt. And here we're funding the projects themselves, or as you've rightly pointed out, the developers themselves. We don't provide lending to the government to then on-lend to the beneficiaries of those green mini-grid programs. We're funding the projects themselves.
Yeah, and when you say you fund the projects or the developers, does that mean you provide equity or debt or grant?
If we're going through some sort of kind of national program, then we might be funding the grant. We have other circumstances where we're going to fund or make debt available, or indeed equity available through platform structures for developers. So we can ultimately end up funding multiple bits of that capital stack.
Dennis, how does GEAPP fit into this landscape of funding organizations?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nico. It's a pleasure to be on this platform. GEAPP is a funding platform formed by 3 philanthropic funds. And our main sort of top-line targets are on improving access, enhancing jobs and livelihoods, and reducing carbon emissions. So for us, really, mini-grids are key to what we do. And we do sort of hold the same appreciation that mini-grids are going to play a key role in electrifying a lot of people in low and middle income countries. On our side, we really are funding into different avenues. We fund into government to improve their capacity so that all the challenges of project development are reduced, whether it be regulatory or sort of any government hand-holding that is required. We also fund directly into private companies, and mostly why we do this is to try and generate proof points to show what works and how can that be enhanced, because it's really a sector that has gone through a lot of motions. And one thing that is clear is there's need to show what sort of models work and scale that as much as possible. Finally, our work is, informed partly by the experience of our colleagues in India. So the Rockefeller Foundation, which is one of our anchor backers, had funded a program in India called Smart Power India 7 or 8 years ago. And the team there really got in neck deep to work with mini-grid developers, and they were able to develop more than 500 grids. And we sort of see a lot of learnings that can be replicated in other countries in the global south. And we want to help do that and help scale that. So our money goes in as catalytic funding and philanthropic flexible funding. So we do think that is needed to take the sector to the place where it needs to be so that it can attract more private funding. Yeah, that's the role that GEAPP is really looking to play in the mini-grid sector in the next couple of years, just get the market ready for the scale that it requires to be at to serve all the people.
Dennis, who are typical recipients of your funding? Is that private sector mini-grid companies? Is that governments? Is that research institutions?
I would say it's sort of spread across the three you've mentioned and even others. We've funded government in Nigeria to create an energy transition office, which is all about the energy transition story in Nigeria. So that is something that we see as necessary to create an enabling environment. And once that is done, we do need to provide the viability gap funding or any sort of capital that is required to tip the projects into execution. So we also fund into developers directly or through instruments that we've funded as well, such as aggregated procurement facilities, the RBF facility called UEF that is run by Sustainable Energy for All, and a lot of other instruments. And we see the need of bringing the community of practice with us. So what we sort of call centers of excellence, where, the organizations which traditionally have been offering very, very good intelligence to the sector, we see value in funding them as well to continue providing the thought leadership that is required and the deep dive analysis that is required for us to get solutions that work across different markets. So I would say it's a breadth of that, plus any other emerging requirements, which is, companies offering appliances or service providers that are necessary to make business models viable in this space.
All right. Given that each of the funders represented here today has a slightly different view on the sector and comes from a different angle, how do funders coordinate amongst each other? For the World Bank, for example, it doesn't make sense to go into a country where there is no developer prepared to pick up the task of implementing mini-grids. For AFDB, you would probably be looking for markets where private sector could actually engage in. And for GEAPP, most probably you're also looking to invest your funds for the development of new concepts into markets that will soon be picked up by one of the large funders for larger mini-grid scale-ups. So how do you coordinate each other? How do you talk to each other? How do you define which countries you will go to next?
So let me go first, Nico, on that. I do want to provide a bit of context for what ESMAP does within the bank, and then that will also help me answer your question more clearly. ESMAP, which is a very long-term energy sector management assistance program, is a separate entity that sits within the World Bank. It's a trust-funded, donor-funded program within which I lead the Global Facility on Mini-Grids. And it's a pretty unique entity. I haven't seen anything like that in any other international organization, really. We have donor funds allocated to us by bilateral donors that we work with, who trust us to then channel those funds to create the pipeline of new World Bank projects. So what we do with that funds that we have directly within ESMAP is that we provide grant support and, more importantly, direct technical assistance and advisory support to our own projects, to our own task teams that are creating new lending programs. And that can be short-term, just-in-time support. That can be long-term support where we embed senior experts onto our teams to help them design the programs, to help inform various studies, the dialogue with the government on draft regulations, whatever that may be. We also do what's called cross-support, where we ourselves, as the core team members, lead the preparation of lending programs directly. And in that way, I guess I would say that I wear two hats within the bank because I work both on the ESMAP side and also directly on the lending side, where I help both develop the pipeline and then also to actually create and implement those projects. That's sort of to address your question about how we coordinate and how we go about developing the pipeline and understanding what markets we need to go in. In a way, it's demand driven. We need to understand that the country is interested and committed to having a program there. And once we get that sense, then we go into a deep donor coordination dialogue with our other partners in that country to see what they've already been doing, what we can help facilitate and catalyze and bring in other donors to come in and partner with us. But in a way, we also target specific countries where we feel that there's a very significant potential. And usually that's the highest access deficit countries, right? And we talk very closely with those teams and help them understand better where the mini-grid market stands, where the access space is at the moment, and what we feel they could benefit from in terms of better understanding the context in that country. In our program, we have what we call the 10 building blocks or the 10 frontiers where we feel the mini-grid market needs to be addressed in order to scale in that country. So we usually work with that task team and with that government to help basically measure where that country stands against each of the 10 building blocks. We have kind of a traffic light system, and we conduct analytics and studies to understand where that country stands, and then we help design programs that target each of the building blocks wherever they may be. And in that sense, we also then work with our other donor partners. We work very closely with our AFDB colleagues, with our Rockefeller and GEAPP colleagues, and many, many others, right, in each country to understand what their instruments are, what their advantages are, how they can come in where we cannot, to help really create that catalytic environment, especially in supporting the government and creating that catalytic environment for the market to flourish.
Thank you, Tatia. This sounds a little bit like World Bank is kind of taking the lead and coordinating with the government to bring in other funders and donors. Is that the same perspective that you have, Dennis? Are you waiting for the World Bank to bring you into a country?
GEAPP is a relatively young organization. We are about 2 years old now. So when it comes to a question of us going into countries, these are countries where a lot of our alliance partners are already operating in. So for us, it's a question of how do we come in and work well together and add value to all the activities that they already do and they're very strong at.
Let me ask the same question to Ben. Ben, is that also your understanding that basically the World Bank goes first and then SEFA comes after?
I wouldn't necessarily characterize it like that. I think there are obviously different countries where the level of donor involvement and integration is different. And I think there are countries where indeed the World Bank is probably extremely well placed to lead on the interactions of government. And I think it makes sense for other donors to support that action. And I think in other circumstances, maybe it's another donor who is leading those interactions. And the example that springs to mind in the immediacy is Madagascar, where kind of arguably GIZ has the longest history of supporting the development of the mini-grid market in the country. And there it makes sense for other donors to support and to try and align activities with that particular donor.
Let's dive a little bit deeper into this Madagascar example. GIZ, for example, is not a large grant funder, right? They can provide technical assistance. They can help government to somehow set up regulation, maybe fund some pilot projects or so. And then if you see, okay, now this is going into the right direction, what happens then?
I think that's a good characterization of the beginning. And indeed, GIZ and then to some degree KfW have gone on to fund particular windows of projects, as they're known in Madagascar. And then other donors have come along and funded subsequent windows. And that includes, in particular, the AFD and the EU. And then more recently, the World Bank is launching a pretty sizable program, which obviously Tatia will be able to provide more information on. And we're in the process of completing a technical assistance, if you like, kind of country review with a view to understanding, what additional funds and what types of funds would be necessary to continue to support that environment. And by quantum and type, I mean, is it grant or is it concessional debt or is it indeed availability of equity that is needed by the developers in order to meet the funding requirements of both the existing calls for proposals and the future planned call for proposals. And actually, to answer your question about coordination, there is a regular bi-monthly donor call, which a number of us participate on, specifically for Madagascar. And there have been kind of bilateral calls between us, World Bank, IFC and GIZ, all with a view to trying to coordinate and to make sure that our support is similar in nature, noting that too many donors and too many different approaches can be quite damaging in terms of the interactions with local stakeholders. So making sure that we have a consistent message. And indeed, I might take the liberty of citing Mauritania as an example where it's worked extremely well. SEFA has just recently announced that it will provide an additional €14.5 million grant to extend the Rimdir mini-grid program that was originally designed signed by the EU, taken up by the AFD, and has also parallel funding from the World Bank. So here you have a lovely example of what is now a fairly sizable program, which will electrify nearly 100 localities through a private sector-led business model, with parallel funding coming from AFD EU on the one side, World Bank, and now SEFA.
Mauritania is definitely an interesting example. Do then all funders agree to the same funding conditions for private sector, which is probably expected to implement the mini-grids?
In the case of Mauritania, the business model that has been, if you like, kind of agreed and negotiated with government, that was very much led by AFD EU at the beginning. They then obviously put a quantum of funds on the table to promote that. And very much that same model has been taken up by the World Bank and now subsequently by SEFA. This is one of the unique cases where SEFA will fund, if you like, through a sovereign operation, where the utility is actually being given the responsibility of rural electrification going forward. And so they will run the procurement process to select the private sector developers on the lots to be procured. And then the grant funding will be made available to the concessionaires who win the procurement, and grant agreements will be signed between the developers and the respective kind of grant funders. So the conditions are all the same, but each funder will manage his grant contracts.
This is really important, I think, what Ben is providing an example for in Mauritania. So another one that I thought was really useful and interesting to exemplify is, of course, the Nigeria case. Right, because Nigeria, as we all know, is by far the most dynamic mini-grid market at the moment. And I think it's also a really good example of a lot of donors partnering and leveraging their strengths in the market. GIZ, of course, had the Nigerian Energy Support Program, NESP, that was active in Nigeria for quite some time. And that really paved the way for the bank to come in with the Nigeria Electrification Project later on, which we launched in 2018, and it became formally effective in 2019. The Nigeria Electrification Project was actually originated by our team in ESMAP. We provided a lot of initial pipeline support, technical assistance on the knowledge side, a lot of analytics and studies, and directly cross-supporting to that project to work with the government. Myself and several of my colleagues were part of that team that set up that project directly in the country. And then, of course, we've had a very close coordination with our AFDB colleagues, who built on a very similar structure of the Nigeria Electrification Project to set up their own NEP project that followed the same rules, the same structure, the same conditions for the private sector, for the developers to follow for the grant program. And I'm happy to say that the NEP so far has been probably the most successful mini-grid program in the world. I think to date, we have about 103 mini-grids that have been commissioned. And now the bank is working with the government to prepare the new Nigeria DARES project, which doubles down on that ambition. And I do feel that in Nigeria in particular, we've seen a very significant example of a lot of donors, a lot of partners coming in and trying to understand what can we from our side add to the equation to really unlock the scale. Another, I think, example that's really useful is Ethiopia, which is a very different context and a very complex context. Very few mini-grid developers, basically no foreign developers present in the market. The World Bank has had a very long-term dialogue there with the government and a lot of presence of other donor partners, but everyone sort of trying to understand how to unlock the market. We sort of came in at the same time as Rockefeller Foundation colleagues were engaging with the government, and we were able to design programs that are quite complementary. We have the Ethiopia ADEL program that the World Bank helped the government design, and the Rockefeller and subsequently GEAPP colleagues have the DREAM pilot program, in which they also engaged the AFDB SEFA colleagues. So we're all kind of trying to push at innovation in the market at the same time. Now, it hasn't been all smooth sailing, of course. It is a complex context with security challenges in the country and with the pandemic and things like that. But it is very much, to me, an example of donor partners working closely together to try and understand how we can all leverage our strength and work in the same direction from our own sort of vantage points.
Tatia, you said earlier that you're mainly responding to demands from governments. Are the governments then taking the lead also in structuring the programs, or is that somebody else? Because usually mini-grids are often new for governments and probably they don't really know how to structure such a program.
So that's a very important question, Nico, and I'm glad that you asked it. Because in the mini grid facility, we interact quite a bit with the private sector, with the developers, obviously. And we do hear a lot of frustration from the private sector on, why is this project taking so long to design, for example, or why is this country not engaging as much on mini grids as we expect it to? And it's really important to remember that the World Bank works with the government on the entire energy sector. Our dialogue is broader than just access or just mini grids specifically. And there is an MOU, there's an understanding on what are the priority areas for the government and where do we come in to support them on all of these, right? On utility reform or tariff review or whatever else may be, efficiency, retrofitting, and then also on access. And that's sort of where the dialogue starts. And then it trickles down slowly to, okay, well, access is a big priority for us. And the World Bank task teams come in and leverage ESMAP expertise and leverage specific access experts within our own teams to help then talk with the line ministries within the government. Usually that's the Ministry of Energy. And sometimes there is a rural electrification agency that we talk to then sit down and discuss, okay, if we're talking about an energy access program, what would that look like? Would there be a grid extension program? Would there be a mini grid component? Would there be standalone solar? We have to work on a least cost electrification plan generally and understand if that is present in the country, if it's up to date, if it's informed by geospatial mapping, and if there's an understanding of the demand side, what does the productive use aspect look like? And then we very much work with the line ministry and with a dedicated agency. Usually we help the government set up a project implementation unit or a project management unit. And then it is our job to support the government, but make sure that they are in the driver's seat, to make sure that they are the ones who feel empowered to design a program that they feel will be most impactful, right? It is not our job to tell the government that this is what you should be doing, but it is our job to support them in identifying the resources, in knowing what are the different tools and the data that might be available to them, obviously to create the knowledge, right? So in ESMAP, we generate a lot of publications and handbooks and policy notes to also really help capacitate and empower them to decide what makes the most sense in each context. So we very much work with the government closely to create and design a project, and that usually takes quite a bit of time. It can take anywhere between 9 and 18 months, depending on the country, to design a project. And then as the project is being implemented, it still takes a lot of time to set up capacity building programs, training programs, twinning programs to help support the implementing agency in what their goal is with that program. So it is in a way a large bureaucracy and it takes time to design our programs, but we are usually the biggest mover in any market. We're the biggest lender. So it is also our responsibility to ensure that we are creating the right environment and that we are hearing what the government is telling us as part of a long-term dialogue to really hopefully set all the right pieces in place.
What, according to your experience, and this is a question to all three of you, what, according to your experience, motivates government to look into mini grids instead of main grid extension or solar home systems? And then the more important question, what can the private sector do to motivate more governments to look into mini grids?
To answer your question, Nico, I think we all know that many national utilities aren't performing very well, and they can be in quite a bit of distress and generally focused on improving service to their existing customers rather than extending the grid to rural and deep rural areas. And that's completely understandable, right? It is important for them to maintain their bottom line and continue to function. So very often governments come to us because they feel that mini grids might be a better solution than trying to pressure the utility company to extend the grid beyond where it would make the most economic sense for them to go. And in that sense, we then talk to the governments closely to understand how does that fit into the broader context of what you want to achieve. Because often governments expect mini grid companies to be able to do impossible things. They expect them to be able to deliver electricity in very deep rural areas, but at the same time to charge the uniform national tariff, because governments feel very strongly about equity and fairness to their citizens, which is obviously very important and the right impulse. But it does take a lot of dialogue for us to highlight to them that the economics just don't work, right? If you feel that your national utility will not be able to extend the grid to those areas without additional subsidies, then a smaller company with tighter margins and higher costs and more expensive debt will not be able to do the same without being able to charge a cost-reflective tariff. And it is a long-term conversation. It fits into the much bigger narrative and dialogue that we have with the government about the tariffs that are charged by the utility, about the regulation that's present in the country, and many other aspects, right? But it is a very important conversation for us to have from the get-go, just to make sure that we're all on the same page about what is and isn't achievable and feasible for developers to do and companies to do within the framework that the government sets. To answer your second question, Nico, about what mini-grid developers can do, I do feel that it's very important for developers to have a united voice. And so that's why we have always made an emphasis and a point to support the African Mini-Grid Developers Association and to partner with them in many contexts to make sure that the developers feel they have a voice in the dialogue with the governments and that they have a representation, because otherwise it can often lead to, bottom-up small systems developing in different markets. But then when the grid arrives, there's just no clarity, and the developers feel that they just have no say in what happens in each country, and that they have to sort of go under the radar in order to enter a market. And that just is not a recipe for a long-term scale-up strategy, right? And national level engagement. So we do feel that it's very important for developers to be part of the dialogue and a part of the conversation. We from our side do a lot for that as well. We create environments where we can have that conversation. We organize stakeholder consultations and private sector consultations, especially when there's a draft regulation under review and things like that. But at the same time, I work with the government. It is my responsibility to be an honest broker and advise the government on what makes the most sense for them. I do feel, and we generally feel, that it's the role of the private sector to organize and have a united voice from their perspective, to speak as one and to get their interests and their priorities across.
Yeah, I would like to talk more about what role you expect AMDA to take. But first, I would like to listen to what Ben has to say.
What I might add is, of course, that mini-grids are not actually a new technology. And I think many governments in Africa have trialed mini-grids in various forms in the past, historically, typically diesel powered. And obviously that was extremely costly to run, has resulted in relatively poor service. So I think many governments are kind of particularly enthused and excited by the idea of the introduction of renewables, thinking that can therefore bring them into operation in a more cost-effective manner. And of course, this is true. But what Tatia was saying around the reality that still doesn't allow these sites to run in a viable fashion on a uniform tariffs. I think there's still quite a lot of education work to be done about a scalable and commercially viable mini-grid market, particularly if then one is constraining the tariff even lower than levels of affordability to try and conform to kind of politically mandated tariffs. And I think one of the things that we're exploring at SEFA are kind of what are the long-term subsidy mechanisms that we can deploy in order to make mini-grids kind of scalable and commercially viable, even in those contexts. And therein, I think, lies the real heart of the challenge for the market. I think we've started to find approaches in markets where we're permitting differentiated tariffs, and Nigeria is the example, where with a certain level of capital subsidy, we can make mini-grids work more or less. But if we start to then mandate kind of alignment with politically mandated tariffs, then at that point, I think we need to have other conversations about system-wide cross-subsidization, or is the case in Ethiopia, kind of, trying to deploy projects which have anchor loads in the form of agri-processing or indeed irrigation. So I think, as Tatia has pointed out, there's still quite a lot of discussion, capacity building and explanation about the subtleties of a commercially viable and therefore scalable approach to mini-grids in a lot of government and public stakeholder quarters.
Coming back to the African Mini-Grid Developers Association, Tatia, you mentioned you would like to see the private sector having a strong voice. What does that mean? Does it mean they should clearly communicate with the government what they need to succeed, or talk to you and say, hey, please push the government into this and that direction, which is probably happening quite often? Or what are you expecting from them?
So I really cannot overstate from my perspective the importance of a unified voice for the sector, right? I think we all know that the African Mini Grid Developers Association is undergoing a big transformation and scale up at the moment. I think they're referring to it as AMDA 2.0, and I think it's a very, very important process. The sector is growing at an exponential breakneck speed, and it's important for there to be a vehicle and a channel for them to coordinate amongst each other, amongst themselves, and to harmonize their dialogue with the government. What that means from my perspective specifically is several key priority areas in which I really think that AMDA needs to play a critical role. One is in terms of capacity building internally across different developers. They have the CEO roundtable that they organize, and I really feel that they have a really important role to play in designing other programs and tools through which they can help developers improve their value proposition, improve their pitches, right, to the lenders, and just overall understand better how they can reduce their costs and maximize their profits, right? Then in terms of the regulatory and policy dialogue that I had mentioned earlier, I think that's really critical. Very often there will be a situation where there's a draft regulation being prepared in a given country, and there wasn't really a meaningful consultation and a dialogue with the actual private sector as part of that process. There will be a consultation, there will be a kind of a formal, announcement and a schedule and conversation kind of with a broader public, but there will not be an expectation and an understanding that this will be nuanced back and forth and meaningful inputs from the developers and from the private sector. And from my perspective, this is absolutely critical, because if you are designing regulation that will have an impact on whether or not a market will actually happen, it's really important to hear from that market and understand if this would address their concerns about the tariff, about the arrival of the grid, about minimum technical standards, whatever that may be, right? Then the other aspect where I think AMDA is and should be playing a critical role is research and data and reporting out on where the market currently stands. We in ESMAP have our own mini grids for 500 million people handbook, which is underpinned by a tremendous amount of data. But down the line, I feel that it is the role of the sector to have more and more of this type of research come out more regularly. And of course, AMDA's already coming out with this, but I do think it's absolutely core to their role in delivering that information to the market, but more importantly to the governments, to highlight to them that, look, this is the scale that we're talking about. This is the potential that we're talking about. This is the job creation potential that we're talking about. And you really need to listen. And finally, I think access to capital. I think AMDA can and should play a bigger role in terms of unlocking capital for the sector and helping the companies have a more unified voice in talking to financiers.
Capital in terms of private capital, equity and debt. And I guess that is where Ben can come in. Are you seeing the approach from AMDA to your organization, to SEFA? Do you get what you actually expect from them?
So before I answer that question, Nico, I was just going to add to what Tatia was saying very briefly. I observe that the private sector isn't always as good, I think, at pointing out its value to governments. I think governments don't necessarily understand the benefit of a private sector-led mini-grid market in terms of, obviously, the ability to mobilize private capital and therefore to accelerate electrification and achievement of universal electrification goals. But also the fact that private sector-led mini-grids are, on the whole, a much better product than traditional electrification. Often much greater uptime, much better quality of service, and generally just a better experience for the end user. And I think that is often not the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of governments in terms of the role of the private sector. And often there is indeed a bit of skepticism. And I think that skepticism is all the truer when one is moving into francophone or lusophone markets. And I think that's where AMDA has probably lagged a little bit. The comms, I think, have been very good in anglophone markets, but I think the francophone markets and the lusophone markets, which of course are pretty sizable on the continent, I think not had the same, level of attention. So kind of that communication, I think, could be improved in those areas. In terms of our engagement with AMDA, obviously we discuss with them frequently, and indeed we kind of bring them on board very often to try and make sure that our support in different countries is meeting what they believe to be required. You asked the question about, how do we help AMDA to better communicate the kinds of requirements that we have when we're looking to fund. And that is very much a hot topic at the moment. AMDA looking at how it provides improved capacity building to its members in order to ready them when they come knocking on our doors for finance. And the kinds of areas where we're seeing a need for improved capacity within the private sector is less on the core business model or the core technical offering. Clearly, that's their mainstay. But it's really around kind of the wider attributes, which are obviously very important. By that, I mean approaches to environmental and social impacts. So making sure that the companies have appropriate structures in place that can meet our funding requirements, that have properly developed gender promotion plans within their own organizations, but also within the sites that they're developing. We need to be mindful of some of the labor considerations within the solar supply chains, which is very much kind of front of our minds. And so kind of really supporting developers to have those kind of policies in place so that they meet our requirements where we're looking to fund.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Tatia and Dennis. This takes us to the end of part 1 of our discussion. Part 2 will be published 1 week after part 1. I am looking forward to the continuation of our talk. Bye for now.
This episode of the Mini Grid Business has been brought to you by Enensys, your one-stop shop for sustainable mini grids. For more information on how to make mini grids work, visit our website, enensys.com, or contact us through the links in the show notes. The Mini Grid Business, powered by Enensys.